Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have reaction request video 110. Finally hit 110. Clash of Angels. This is part of Arch Warhammer's Siege of Vrax series and has been requested by Death Grips and CJ Falcon, so let's check it out. Ready and play. Da da.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vrax. Last episode was a bit of a roller coaster ride, wasn't it? The Death Corps
just a bit of a roller coaster ride.
A proper breakthrough, and it was time to make up for all of the lost time so far. And they just might have gotten away with it too if it weren't for those meddling bastards in the Cardinal's command staff, who had proven themselves to be far more resourceful than the Imperials had given them credit for, launching a bold and massively executed counterattack whilst also withdrawing from the first line of defences, catching the Death Corps in a hook that hit them in their left flanks, overrun the 19th Siege Regiment guarding said flank, and then threatened the entirety of the First Line Corps. And by extension, the Vraxian counterattack could possibly threaten the entirety of the 88th Siege Army. Thusly, the other three line corps had to cancel their offensive operations against the second defensive line and detach infantry and armoured reserves to aid the first line corps. And the most vital of these reinforcements dispatched was, of course, the 11th Assault Corps. This was to be the key element in the attack on the second defensive line, and now it had to be withdrawn and sent northwards just in case the Vraxian counterattack was able to break through the first line corps out to the perimeter and threaten the entirety of the 88th Siege Army.
Yeah.
Eventually, the Vraxian counterattack was slowed and halted, although at considerable cost, leaving the current situation as you see here. The First Line Corps has fallen back and created an improvised position holding off the Vraxian forces, who have also dug into improvised positions. Beneath them is the 30th, the 12th, and the 34 Line Corps, all facing off against the second defensive line, which has been massively reinforced by the Vraxian troops who retreated from the first. But reinforced or not, the Imperials had to keep attacking. The window of opportunity had pretty much come and gone, but that alone was not enough reason to abort the offensive. It would just have to be slowed down and carried out in a more deliberate manner. Essentially, the 30th, the 12th, and the 34th were now once again doing the exact same thing that they'd been doing against the first line of defences. Which may at first sound all well and proper. They got through the outer line in that way, so surely they could do it again here. Well, kinda. The first line was broken apart, of course, around Fort A453, via a combination of luck, happenstance, and dogged determination. And so far, only the latter was present against the second line. For whilst the Death Corps was as determined as ever, they seemed to have used up all of their luck. And the enemy also seemed unwilling to allow the same happenstances that occurred around the fort to repeat themselves. However, the failure to create another breakthrough was most certainly not for lack of trying. All three line corps launched repeated attempts against the Vraxian positions, but this line was proving even more formidable than the first. Wherever the corps began making progress, they would soon run into some impediment. An expertly placed flanking position, for example, pouring autocannon fire into the advancing troops. The offensive would then be widened to take in these positions as well and destroy them. Then the fresh company sent against the new positions would run into yet more strong points that required dealing with, and so another company was dragged in, and so on and so on and so on, until entire regiments were embroiled up and down the Corps' front line. And there appeared to be no exceptions to this rule. Whatever the Kriegsguardsmen attacked, they would run into some form of hindrance that could not be ignored. First, it might be a pillbox on a hill sweeping the advance with heavy bolter fire. Then, when a Lehman Russ is brought up to deal with the pillbox, the tank is destroyed by a las cannon battery. So grenadiers are sent forward to deal with the las cannon battery. Then they run into a concealed storage bunker from which Hellhound flamethrower tanks charge out and into the grenadiers' mists. And so more tanks are brought up and find more AT positions, and so more infantry is brought up, which in turn finds more pillboxes, and so on and so on.
Wow.
The siege army was bleeding itself white, and for virtually no gains. Every time they destroyed a pillbox, it would simply just reveal 2 further positions right behind it. Every time they started pushing deep into the Vraxian trench lines, they would organize a massive counterattack and push the Kriegsguardsmen back out again. It would appear that the Vraxians had learned their lesson from the fort. They
definitely wanted it to be
no longer were the Kriegsguardsmen allowed to get any sort of foothold for even the briefest period of time before large quantities of mechanized Vraxian troops rushed in and pushed them back out again. It had taken 3 days to complete the breakthrough of Fort A453, and the Vraxians simply were not letting the Imperials have that kind of time anymore. On the bright side, all of these extraordinarily well organized and executed counterattacks had finally convinced Lord Commander Julka that the Vraxians did actually appear to know what they were doing. Unfortunate as that may be, at the very least it allowed the Krieg commanders on the ground to take a few further precautions, and perhaps try to even come up with some countermeasures, although, to be fair, they were severely limited in what they could actually do to counter this. The Vraxian counterattack troops were kept close to the front line, deep underground in reinforced and armored shelters, virtually entirely immune to even the heaviest Imperial shelling. Meanwhile, the Krieg assault reserves had to be kept often at least a day's travel away from the front line, so as to avoid the Vraxians identifying and annihilating them with artillery barrages. Luckily, however, it wasn't all bad news, as at least to the north, things were not quite as static. Reinforced by elements of the 34th, the 12th, and the 30th Line Corps, along with the 11th Assault Corps, the 1st Line Corps had managed to successfully halt the Vraxian counterattack, ending the threat to the army's flanks, and was now slowly but surely beginning to force the Vraxians back. On open terrain like this, the Krieg Death Corps had every advantage. Nevertheless, they were facing an enemy that was highly mechanized and mobile, with considerable quantities of armored support, meaning that it was no easy task to get them to retreat. The Vraxians had also brought along considerable quantities of infantry, which had dug into improvised positions. This combination of infantry in entrenched positions, along with vast quantities of armored and mechanized vehicles, meant that every position had to be tackled individually, with overwhelming firepower. The Krieg Death Corps would bring to bear vast quantities of artillery to shatter the infantry positions, and then engaged with the armored elements in massive open-field armored clashes. The casualties on both sides, both in men and material, were dramatic, but, once again, the Death Corps could replace them. The Vraxians could not. And after the brilliant maneuvers seen in the previous episode, it is almost a little baffling to see the Vraxians engaged in this sort of open attritional warfare against a clearly superior enemy. The most likely explanation for this is that the Vraxians had not expected to advance as quickly as they had. And once Vraxian High Command noticed how swiftly they were advancing, perhaps they saw an opportunity to win the whole war right then and there, and they weren't entirely mistaken. There had been at least the possibility of this, but by the time they realized that they were considerably overextended and that there was no swift victory to be had, they were too deeply enmeshed with the First Line Corps to disengage
no swift
swiftly.
Victory at all.
The Varaxians had undoubtedly displayed a real talent for the art of withdrawing in the face of the enemy. But whilst it is certainly one thing to withdraw from an enemy in mostly static positions without them noticing, it is an entirely different thing to disengage from an enemy that is constantly launching their own attacks and probing maneuvers to stop what they perceive to be your own offensive actions. And, to be entirely fair, it was an absolute miracle that the Varaxians managed to execute the withdrawal that they had already managed to pull off. Even the Varaxian command staff were undoubtedly aware of this, and they might therefore be rather hesitant to try pushing their luck again so soon. Instead, the Varaxian General Staff decided to go for a safer, if possibly also costly option. They would start giving ground to the Krieg Death Corps slowly but surely, and most importantly, in an organized fashion, ensuring that the Death Corps could not cause any major breakthroughs in their front line, which could threaten portions of the Varaxian forces to be cut off from the rest, encircled, and destroyed. This was a slow, deliberate, and certainly expensive strategy, but it was also far safer than attempting a wild dash back to their own lines. If they could only withdraw slowly but in a controlled fashion, they could ensure that they kept the Death Corps in front of them and their own lines to their rear, ensuring the eventual safe withdrawal of their forces. This slow and controlled withdrawal would take place over the course of the next 6 months, with the Varaxians very slowly and very carefully withdrawing their forces as the Death Corps started their offensive, ensuring that there would be enough resistance to prevent any potential breakthroughs and also ensuring that their troops would have a clear line to pull back from. Whilst on the Death Corps side, they wished, of course, to inflict as heavy casualties upon the Varaxians as possible, trying to break through their lines, isolating portions of the defenders and annihilating them piecemeal, or engaging large concentrations of Varaxians from the front, ensuring that they could not withdraw successfully until heavy artillery could be brought into position to stomp all over the Varaxians in their improvised defenses. And thusly, in this fashion, the war dragged on for half a year. What had taken a week to lose took 6 months to reclaim. And the Varaxians eventually managed to complete their withdrawal, the last few scarred and battered remnants of their spearhead eventually slinking back behind the second defensive line. The Krieg Death Corps, on their hand, had been successful in inflicting considerable casualties upon the enemy's armored elements, reducing them to but a mere shadow of the force that had once launched itself against the 19th Siege Regiment. All in all then, it was kind of difficult to decide who had actually won this engagement. On the one hand, the defenders had of course gained that most valuable of resources, namely time. They had been able to prevent the Death Corps from launching all of its strength against the second defensive line and possibly gaining a decisive breakthrough that might even have ended the war right then and there, or at the very least made the secondary defensive line untenable. On the other hand, whilst they had carried out a very successful flanking attack against the 88th Siege Army and the 19th Siege Regiment in particular, they had also used a vast quantity of offensive resources to do so. It was unlikely that the Varaxians would be able to carry out an offensive of this scale and complexity ever again, at the very least not without substantial reinforcements. And mind you, what they would need the most would be experienced manpower. The losses in materiel was easily replenished from the vast stores beneath Varax, but the loss of experienced crews capable of operating armored vehicles in a cohesive and coordinated fashion, that was a hell of a lot harder to replenish. even more so when the casualties were of this magnitude. On the Krieg side of things, they had suffered between 100 to 400,000 casualties, well in excess of 1,000 armored vehicles had been lost, and an unknown number of guns. On the Vraxian side of things, we do not have any solid numbers, but considering they were fighting the Death Corps toe-to-toe, without much of an advantage in the open for half a year, we can safely assume that they were considerable. Even if we were to be extraordinarily generous and assume they only suffered half the casualties of the Death Corps due to their obvious advantage during the first week or so of the engagement, that would still leave them down something along the lines of 250,000 men and 500 plus armored vehicles. And in all due likelihood, that is, as mentioned, an overly generous estimate. In this kind of warfare over this kind of time span against an enemy possessing superior firepower, coordination, and artillery support, I would be very surprised if their casualties were not at least as bad as the Death Corps, and possibly even worse. And again, the key thing here is to remember that the Death Corps was able to replenish these casualties. In fact, by the time they reached the second defensive line 6 months later, the first line corps had not only fully replenished itself, it had received additional forces from Krieg itself. In other words, after 6 months of warfare, the 88th Siege Army was stronger than ever, whilst the Vraxian defenders had never been weaker. Fat load of good, however, that seemed to be doing the Imperials, as they were now stuck in yet another complete deadlock situation, facing off against the inner defences of the Vraxians. This was all that stood between the Imperials and the curtain walls of the inner citadel, and yet they could not seem to get any closer. And so this was the situation 6 months after the Vraxian counterattack. The advance of the First Line Corps had finally completed the encirclement of the Vraxian defenders 6 months after schedule, but still, it was something, and at this point it was also the only measurable piece of progress that the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army had actually made. Along the entire length of the front line, it was complete stalemate, and not for lack of trying. The other line corps, weakened though they were, had launched continuous offensives against the inner defensive line, but they had all achieved the precise same thing. Nothing. Zip, nil, no, nada. No footholds, no advances, little to no ground gained, and certainly no breakthroughs. Lord Commander Julka's bid to make up for lost time had spectacularly failed. It had been over 2 years now since the Imperials had landed on Vrax, and they had only now completed the encirclement of the inner defensive line, something they should have done shortly after the initial preparations. In other words, they were something along the lines of a year behind schedule. It was very much so time for Lord Commander Julka to do something drastic to get the siege back on schedule, but just like the failure of the first offensive, after which the Lord Commander had simply withdrawn back to his comforts and left the business of the siege up to his commanders, he did the exact same thing now as well. And whilst you might argue that leaving the command of the siege up to the professionals, the Krieg Death Corps, might not be the worst idea, but the simple fact is that the only one that had the authority to organize the kind of large-scale push they were going to need to break through the inner defensive line was Lord Commander Julka. And without that kind of authority, the only real options left to the Death Corps was, well, one, come up with something entirely brand new and innovative to break the deadlock, which, as wonderful as the Death Corps is, innovation and risk-taking is not really what they're known for. They tend to prefer the old tried, true, and tested method of simply going after the enemy until something breaks. The problem was that the Vraxians had proved themselves to be very adept indeed at playing the defender. The events that had transpired around Fort A453 to cause the first breakthrough were 1,000,000 to 1 happenstance. And whilst I am sure that the Death Corps would be able to reproduce said happenstance if given enough time, they were, as mentioned, on a schedule. A fairly strict one as well, considering, again, they were looking for something that was rather unlikely, shall we say, to happen. But, unfortunately, once again, lacking any sort of direct leadership from the top, that was exactly what happened. For the next 5 years, the Death Corps simply carried out relatively small-scale line corps-sized offensives against the inner defensive line. They were constantly reinforced by additional reinforcements and replacements from Krieg, but nothing more came of it. Lord Commander Julka and his command staff offered virtually nothing in the way of direct instructions throughout the entirety of this period, until finally, 7 years after the initial landings on Vrax, a report came across the Lord Commander's desk that simply could not be ignored. In Sector 5249, the 261st Siege Regiment had been making some actual gains for the first time in many years. They had managed to create a small foothold in the enemy's outer defences, through which they had sent through several Gorgon heavy assault transports, along with their complements of grenadiers and several Lehman Russ main battle tanks. This was by far the closest the besiegers had actually gotten to creating a breakthrough in the inner defensive line. And yet, this promising offensive was not only completely shut down, but utterly reversed, including the loss of the dearly bought foothold that they had established. And yet that was merely the tip of the bad news iceberg. Failed offensives happened all the time. Granted, this was a particularly promising one, but even that was not out of the ordinary. No, the really bad news arrived when the survivors made it back to their own lines and delivered their own reports, suggesting that the attack had been crushed by Adeptus Astartes.
What?
Well, on the bright side, that at least explains why the attack was crushed so thoroughly and so quickly. Every cloud has a silver lining and all that, but that still leaves the considerably more important question, namely, what, by the God Emperor's shiny butt cheeks, are Space Marines doing fighting for the traitors? It is, of course, rather unusual for Loyalist Space Marines to fight against other Loyalists, but it does on occasion happen. Either because the chapter has their own vested interests in the conflict and decides that the other Loyalist parts are against that interest, and since the Astartes always consider their interests to be of paramount importance, that could lead to conflict.
That is very strange.
It could also be something so simple, although also so silly, as a misunderstanding, where the Astartes have some ties, for example, to the Cardinal, or perhaps even to the planet, and therefore decided that whoever invaded the planet must be the aggressors and the guilty party, without taking too close of a look, shall we say, at the actual invaders. So there could, in theory, be several reasons for why Loyalist Space Marines would be fighting alongside the traitors. To see if he could figure out one of these reasons, Lord Commander Julka sent an emissary to the officers of the Lord Commander Militant to hear if he could help in identifying the chapter, or even possibly outright locating them and figuring out the reason why they were fighting for the Vraxians. The emissary was also instructed to inform the Lord Commander Militant that the siege on Vrax was going swimmingly. Now, yes, there were some small complications, some minor problems here and there, and perhaps,
some
the time schedule
pains.
was
a
hint behind
pains.
where it should be, but none of this was any real problems. However, if Lord Commander Julka could receive another 500,000 men from Vrax in addition to the usual reinforcements, that would be great. It would really help the siege army to get across that last little hump and ensure that they could pass the finish line in a timely manner. The Lord Commander Militant accepted Julka's request for more men, and the process to organize yet another line corps was started on Krieg, with the creation, recruiting, and equipping of the formation. As for the Astartes, however, that was a bit more difficult. the Lord Commander Militant sent out requests for information
they
to the various loyalist chapters in the Segmentum, but they received reports back that all of the various chapters whose insignia or color pattern resembled those who had been reported to Lord Commander Julka could account for all of their warriors. The only explanation then was the obvious one. The Space Marines on Vrax were not loyalists. And that suddenly made everything a hell of a lot worse. At least in the case of loyalist Space Marines, they must be there for some kind of misunderstanding, which could then presumably be resolved. Traitors, however, that meant that some rather unfortunate forces had taken notice of the problem on Vrax, and had started offering their services to the Cardinal.
Chaos Vrax? Or
things were about to get a lot worse
Chaos Astartes?
yet again. And meanwhile, whilst Imperial High Command was panicking, the Cardinal was rejoicing. Finally, the Emperor's avenging angels, the Space Marines, had come to his aid, and they were led by a particularly strapping fellow that introduced himself as Lord Arkos of the Alpha Legion. Now, of course, whether or not he introduced himself in quite that fashion, we do not know. The Cardinal personally still thought that he was the one in the right here, that he was still the true loyalist, and that once he was done with this nonsense on Vrax, he would sally forth from the planet and sweep the sector free of heresy. And thusly, you might think that if he met a member of the Alpha Legion, he would react rather poorly, but this is in fact not a given. Information about the Great Heresy is of course vigorously suppressed by the Inquisition, and even for somebody like Cardinal Zaphon, who was pretty damn far up on the Ministorum's rank ladder, it was far from a given that he would recognize the name Alpha Legion, or that he would know that they were traitors. It is of course also entirely possible that Lord Arkos simply just lied to him. It wouldn't be the first time the Alpha Legion has manipulated the truth, after all. Regardless of how he introduced himself, Lord Arkos' aid was more than welcome, as he was ushered into the Cardinal's good graces with arms wide open. And why not? As far as the Cardinal was concerned, this was obviously to his benefit. Not only would this contribute a band of extraordinarily powerful combat troops to his cause, it was also, as far as he was concerned, a direct endorsement from the Emperor. After all, these were, once again his wink-wink, avenging angels. And undoubtedly, it would be a considerable boost to morale amongst those fighting beneath them to finally have their faith vindicated by this, the Emperor's own sons fighting alongside them. And, as already mentioned, the fact that they were also ridiculously good at fighting probably didn't exactly harm morale either.
Oh yeah.
And that is before we get into the other morale benefit of having Space Marines on your side. If they weren't up against the Death Corps of Krieg, the mere mention of the fact that the enemy had Adeptus Astartes fighting for them could have caused widespread panic. In the case of the Death Corps of Krieg, however, at least they didn't have to worry about that, since Krieg Guardsmen are not exactly known for their skittish nature. But of course, merely not being afraid of the enemy doesn't solve the bigger problems in the case of fighting against Traitor Astartes. Namely the fact that pretty much regardless of how many standard issue Imperial flashlights you've got, you're going to be struggling just to actually hurt one of the bastards, much less kill them. Now, granted, the Lucius pattern lasgun stood a better chance than most lasguns in penetrating power armor, but it is also true that a whole gummy bear has a far better chance at penetrating the front of a Tiger tank than half a gummy bear. It still doesn't mean that there's a particularly good chance of it happening. And the obviously inherent complication then is that if the Krieg Death Corps had struggled to break through the enemy's lines already, they were going to be struggling a hell of a lot more if any potential breakthrough would be faced down by nigh invulnerable demigods of battle. This was most definitively a wee bit of a problem for the 88th Imperial Guard siege army.
Yeah, just a bit.
But luckily, their intrepid leader, Lord Commander Julka, did what he usually did when something didn't go his way. He wobbled furiously for a few minutes like a large piece of angry jello, and then settled right the hell back down again into his inert state.
Nice.
Fortunately, his direct superior, the Lord Commander Militant, was a man of a bit more action, shall we say, and sent his aides out into the galaxy looking for reinforcements, or, well, technically not reinforcements, but at the very least, aid. And since they were looking for help in dealing with Chaos Astartes, they were of course out fishing for power armor of their very own.
Yeah.
This was of course far easier said than done, as the mighty Space Marines tend to be a somewhat obstinate lot, intent more upon their own goals and aspirations rather than aiding anybody else. And in this case, the Lord Commander Militant only had his own authority to fall back upon, since the original plans that would involve Astartes' forces had been rejected. Thusly, this request did not bear the seal of the High Lords of Terra, and this could potentially be very important indeed. Whilst, of course, the Astartes are independent from the wider command structure of the Imperium, the High Lords are the de facto rulers of the Imperium, and whilst, again, the Astartes don't technically owe them anything, they will usually at least pretend to consider their requests. In this case, however, the Lord Commander Militant only had his own authority to fall back on, which, whilst again being considerable, how do I put it? You need to understand that the Astartes are an incredibly busy lot, both with doing their own nonsense, which they usually consider to be far more important than anybody else's nonsense, and with putting out constant fires raging across the Imperium.
Because there's
so
a lot
even if
of those.
the Astartes ignore a request, it isn't necessarily just because they're assholes. That might be part of the reason, and indeed in some cases it might be the entire reason, but quite often they are simply busy with bigger and far worse things, and as of yet, the situation on Vrax had not deteriorated to a catastrophic level. It was almost certainly going to, now that traitor legionnaires had become involved, but as of yet, it was not a major concern. Thusly, it could take years or even decades before the Lord Commander Militant received any responses to his requests. In this case, however, it turned out that one of the Lord Commander Militant's emissaries was a very good fisherman indeed, as he got one hell of a catch, and almost immediately after being sent out to fish for replies also. He received a reply to his request directly from Supreme Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels. And the good news didn't end there. Not only were the Dark Angels going to commit themselves to an action on Vrax, they would be committing fully half their chapter's strength.
Wow.
5 full companies of Dark Angels would begin their journey towards Vrax aboard the battle barge Angel of Retribution and the strike cruisers Sword of Caliban and Salvation, with a small fleet of escort vessels in tow. This was of course a huge commitment of force from the Dark Angels. And whilst of course I'm sure both Julka and the Lord Commander Militant would be very, very hesitant to look this particular gift horse in the mouth, it seemed like a rather overblown response considering the threat. Now, don't get me wrong, the presence of traitor Astartes is a huge threat in and of itself, and would almost certainly destabilize the entire war, but half a chapter's worth of Dark Angels, along with a battle barge and 2 strike cruisers. That is a massive force. Entire planets have literally been conquered by single companies. And here was 5 of them. If Lord Commander Julka was half as smart as he was fat, he would be sweating bullets right about now, trying to figure out exactly what kind of threat the Dark Angels had seen on the planet that would require the deployment of a full 5 companies of Astartes.
That is a good point.
But, as is so often true, ignorance really is bliss. However, you might be thinking right about now that something doesn't really seem to add up. For example, what By the Lion's favorite crying cushion is a Dark Angel doing within 7,000 astral miles of anything even remotely resembling altruism, which dedicating half your chapter to helping somebody else would undoubtedly qualify as? Well, you are probably extraordinarily unsurprised to find out that charity work had absolutely nothing to do with this. Nor
so
does helping the Krieg Guardsmen have anything to do with this. This, as usual with the Dark Angels, has only got to do with them. Grandmaster Azrael has received word that a member of Arcos's Alpha Legion warband might know the whereabouts of a member of the Fallen, the part of the Dark Angels Legion that went against the Emperor and declared independence from the Imperium during the Great Heresy.
Okay.
And now that we have confirmed that these incoming Astartes are indeed Dark Angels, by establishing that they are acting purely in their own self-interest, which is certainly the most easily identifiable trait of the Dark Angels chapter and Legion before it, we can move on to the actual plan. The Dark Angels, of course, had the objective of capturing as many of the Chaos Traitor Marines as possible, so that Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor could drag them into his lovely dungeons and make them talk, presumably by plying them with tea and biscuits, interrupted only occasionally by a swift bout of torture or a sudden blow to the head. This then necessitated that the Dark Angels attack something that would be considered very valuable, and therefore defended by Chaos Space Marines. And since simply landing directly on top of the Vraxian Citadel was still a no-go due to the frankly heretical quantities of anti-aircraft guns, the Dark Angels would have to make do with the second best option, the Vraxian Starport. This would also help to make it appear as if the Dark Angels were actually doing something to help the 88th Siege Army. By taking the main starport, they would both allow the Krieg Guardsmen to bring in further reinforcements, and it would also make it impossible for the Cardinal to bring down further reinforcements to his own side. The fact that the latter half of that particular bonus had already been taken care of by the Krieg Guardsmen, now sitting directly astride the only route from the starport to the Citadel, was promptly ignored. And speaking of the Imperial Guard, Azrael did not send a single communique either to the commanders on the ground of the 88th Siege Army, to Lord Commander Julke, or any other Imperial officer in system or on world. Him and his Astartes, including their fleet, simply sailed up to Vrax, expected the Imperial Navy presence to move the fuck out of the way, which they promptly did, and then began disgorging their Astartes onto their objective, which in this case was the Sarna Flats. But before we get to the Dark Angels battle plan, let's have a quick updated look at the Vraxian battlefield. Now that Lord Commander Julke had received the reinforcements in the form of the 46th Lion Corps, the deployment of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army had changed a little bit. To the south, we still had the 34th Lion Corps, with the 12th to their immediate flank.
But it's awfully convenient
by the newly arrived
that they just happen to have
with the
interest
to their left,
in these
and finally,
Alpha
the
Legion
Corps,
guys.
completing the encirclement
So they're
of
like,
and
yeah,
also
sure,
off the line
here's half of us.
And travel to the Vraxian starport. The newly arrived 46th Lion Corps was slightly smaller than the corps already in position, consisting of 3 Krieg siege regiments, totaling some 375,000 men. In addition to the other reinforcements, the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army now consisted of roughly 3.8 million men. And of course, all of that mattered to Azrael not one fucking bit. Because at the end of the day, if he were to involve the Krieg Guardsmen in any of his plans, in all due likelihood they would simply just get in the way. and thusly it was much better to simply just ignore them, and hope they in turn had the good sense to ignore him. Not that he was going to give them much choice in the matter, mind you, as he was planning what was essentially a lightning strike on the Vraxian starport, intending to hit it, destroy it, and be gone again before any of the Krieg line corps could get involved. And the first step in that plan was to land all of his forces on the Sarna Flats. This area had been briefly considered for landings by the Death Corps of Krieg as well, but the terrain was extraordinarily inhospitable, even by Vraxian standards, and the somewhat limited area available meant that it would be extraordinarily difficult to bring down enough supplies to keep even one line corps supplied for continuous combat operations. Of course, the Astartes had no such problems. They numbered a mere, quote-unquote, 500 battle brothers. This force could easily be supplied from orbit using their own drop pods and Thunderbolt transports. Additionally, of course, the Dark Angels did not intend to get embroiled in a lengthy ground battle. Their objective, as mentioned, was to hit the starport and get out again as quickly as possible, whilst also doing the maximum amount of damage to said starport. Which, by the way, is a hell of a lot easier said than done. A starport on the scale of the one found on Vrax is essentially a medium-sized city, capable of transporting entire regiments of Imperial Guard on and off the planet, along with vast quantities of ammunition, supplies, vehicles, men, armor, weapons, etc. All of the myriad things that the Imperial Guard might require. To level such a complex would require either a ludicrous amount of firepower or a solid amount of time. And whilst the Adeptus Astartes certainly are in possession of a fair bit of wallop when it comes to good old-fashioned HE, even they didn't possess a bomb quite big enough to level a starport in one go, so they would require some time. Additionally, they also had their own private objective of enticing the Chaos Space Marines into the fight so that they could capture some of them and bring them off planet. To do this, they would necessarily have to create a situation in which the Chaos Space Marines thought that their involvement might actually tip the tides. In other words, they couldn't be too quick and too effective, because of course, Arcus's warband were veterans of many a conflict. If they saw no hope of winning, they simply would not engage. But of course, at the exact same time, it couldn't be made too obvious that it was a trap either, because once again, they were hunting a rather cunning foe here. Thusly, with all of these various objectives in mind, Azrael's plan started to take form. First and foremost, as already mentioned, the main landing would take place on the Sarna Flats via Thunderhawk and drop pods. This would be a rapid insertion, the likes of which only the Adeptus Astartes could carry out. It would take an Imperial Guard regiment days to deploy onto the surface of a planet, all the whilst they would be pounded by the Vraxian orbital defenses, which would be rather unfortunate. For the Dark Angels, however, they would require hours at most, and in all due likelihood, minutes, to unload the vast majority of their strike force, and then subsequently move their own void-faring crafts out of the line of fire. It might also be possible to drop the forces directly on top of the starport, but it was a fairly well-fortified structure, with a considerable quantity of anti-aircraft defenses. Additionally, a strike directly at the starport would also run the risk of being too swift of an operation, not giving the enemy Space Marines enough time to react, and therefore not fulfilling the most important part of the mission, that which served the self-interest of the Dark Angels. Thusly, the location on the Sarna Flats was the one eventually chosen. It did offer several other benefits, like, for example, it was out of the way for the Vraxian defenders. If they wanted to get to the landing point, they would have to cross several massive ravines themselves. It was also sheltered from any form of enemy long-range artillery. And since the Vraxians also lacked any form of an air force, this meant that the Dark Angels were free to set up a forward operating positions in the Sarna Flats, complete with supply dumps, allowing for easy resupply of the forward elements.
Nice.
And once the strike force was down on the plant of Vrax, it was split into 2 separate elements. The first would consist of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Company of the Dark Angels, and would consist of tactical and Terminator squads mounted in Rhinos and Land Raiders, along with land speed squadrons, assault bikes, and the famous Ravenwing bike squadrons. Whilst the main assault force made its way towards the Vraxian starport from the south, the 3rd Company would remain back at the forward operating base to finish the construction and deployment of the mostly prefabricated buildings and the automated sentry turrets that would protect the base in the Astartes' absence.
Nice.
This, however, did not mean that the 3rd Company was entirely out of the dance. Quite the contrary, in fact, their part of the operation was the most important of them all. You see, the Vraxians, of course, knew that the Astartes were inbound. In fact, the Dark Angels made damn sure that they would know. However, this did not mean that the Vraxians knew where the Dark Angels would strike. And this was not the lumbering, massive infantry formations of the Death Corps of Krieg. The Astartes were an incredibly mobile force.
They definitely were much smaller.
More than capable of breaking... capable of simply just breaking straight through pretty much any defensive line the Vraxians could put in front of them. Or simply just flying right over the defensive lines in the Thunderhawk gunships. Or simply just landing straight on top of the defenses with their elite troops utilizing drop pods. There was, quite simply, no real way for the Vraxians to know where the hammer blow was going to land. All they knew was that it was going to land somewhere, and with tremendous force at that. The Cardinals' initial response was to order virtually all mobile reserves back to the main citadel, including considerable quantities of the troops actually manning the second defensive line. The Cardinals' fear was that the Dark Angels would launch a decapitating strike directly against the Vraxian main citadel, with himself as the primary target.
That would make sense.
Lord Arcos of the Alpha Legion presented him with a different idea. He argued that the citadel's defenses were still very powerful, and thusly the Dark Angels would not risk a direct attack on the citadel, for fear of losing an unacceptable portion of their strike force. And thusly, since they could not be sure where the Dark Angels would strike, Lord Arcos suggested the establishment of a mobile defense force. This rapid reaction troop would consist of the most mobile, well-armed, armored, and experienced troops that yet remained in the Vraxian defense force. Additionally, Lord Arcos volunteered the services of himself and his warband to act as the spearhead of this formation. The idea being quite simply that Lord Arcos' warband would engage the Dark Angels, tie them down, prevent them from simply blowing right through the initial engagement force, and then overwhelm them with numbers. It wasn't the most subtle of tactics, to be sure, but it might very well prove effective. There was, however, one tiny little problem that the traitors were as of yet unaware of. Namely, that the formation of such a rapid response force was exactly what Supreme Grandmaster Azrael was hoping for. As already mentioned, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Companies would make an assault upon the southern outskirts of the Vraxian starport. Once they had reached the outskirts, they would begin fighting their way into the starport. And whilst doing so, they would make every effort to appear as if they had come to capture it relatively intact, and use it as a base of operations to bring down yet further forces, including possibly Imperial Guard elements, to continue an offensive against the Vraxian capital. Azrael reasoned that this would achieve 2 things. 1, the Vraxians would not be able to let the starport fall without a fight. It was their only hope of future reinforcements from off-world, and furthermore, if it was lost and turned into a forward operating base for the Imperials, that might very well mean that the Death Corps would be able to establish yet another line corps to the rear of the Vraxian defenses, whilst also being able to supply said line corps, which, you must remember, once again, the problem of supplying such a formation was the primary reason why it had not been deployed in this area to begin with. With the starport in Imperial hands, that
this
would no
leader
longer
of
be
the Dark
an issue.
Angels is brilliant.
And secondly, Azrael also reasoned
Out
that
for
the traitor
himself,
Space Marines
but
would
brilliant.
take a particular interest in any attack upon the starport, since it represented their best hope of getting additional reinforcements on the planet, just as with the Vraxians, but for the traitors, it was even more valuable for a different reason. Namely, the simple fact that it represented the only credible way off the planet for them if things should turn sour. However, this alone might not be enough. Azrael was more than aware that whilst Chaos Astartes were the most vile and horrible of heretics, they were rarely stupid. And they would undoubtedly notice that the starport was in a somewhat precarious position. The two primary routes of access to the starport, shown here in blue, had been cut off by the First Line Corps. This then left only one major route still open, shown here in red. It would first head south from the Vraxian Citadel into the plains of Saramita, which it would then cross into the Sarna Flats before heading up to the Vraxian starport. This route had originally been designed as a small, tertiary route for any supplies that weren't heading to the primary hab blocks or to the Vraxian Citadel and the main armories itself. This route was capable of supporting fairly considerable traffic, but absolutely paled in comparison to the mega highways of the two primary routes. It should, however, be more than enough to transport the Vraxian Rapid Response Force and Lord Arcos' warband relatively rapidly and relatively safely. It would bring the Vraxians uncomfortably close to the Dark Angels' landing position, but the Sarna Flats were anything but flat. They were covered in various crisscrossing ravines and gullies of different sizes, in addition to extraordinarily inhospitable terrain. It certainly wasn't entirely impassable from the south, but it would most certainly be considered challenging terrain at the absolute best. But once again, traitor legionnaires are not stupid. You don't live particularly long in the service of the ruinous powers if you are. If they smell the trap, they would not leave the Citadel. But, of course, Azrael was not particularly dumb either and had predicted this. This was why he had sent the vast majority of his forces to attack the starport. He reasoned, quite rightly so, that once the traitors noticed that the majority of his forces were attacking the starport, and that his Dark Angels were not making the rapid progress they might have expected, entirely intentionally from the Dark Angels' side, mind you, they would feel confident in committing to an attack, seeing an opportunity to destroy the Dark Angels, and gain not only a massive morale victory, but also inflicting a decisive defeat upon a huge potential threat. The bait was almost certainly far too juicy to resist. And once the enemy had been well and truly hooked, the Third Company would leap into action. After allowing a nice big chunk of enemies to enter the starport, they would launch from the forward operating base. The Third Company consisted of assault specialists mounted in Thunderhawk gunships. They would fly with all possible speed towards the massive bridges spanning the huge ravine separating the starport from the main route of travel. Once the Thunderhawks arrived on scene, they would deploy their assault marine specialists directly on top of the bridges using jump packs. After that, the Thunderhawks would disengage and start scattering the remainder of the enemy's reserves on the cut-off side of the bridge, ensuring that they could not interfere with the assault marines, while they took the bridges, held them temporarily whilst they placed demolition charges, and then destroyed them. The end result then would be that the main bulk of the enemy's reinforcements would be trapped on the wrong side of the ravine, whilst the juicy parts, including the traitor marines, would be trapped in the starport, facing off now against the full might of 5 companies of Dark Angels, who could now take their sweet-ass time destroying their enemies. The Vraxians no longer had any real way of reinforcing or evacuating them, and the Chaos Space Marines, along with their new Vraxian allies, could be isolated and picked off one by one, ensuring that the Dark Angels could also bring back plenty of souvenirs for their interrogator chaplains. Or at least, that was the plan. Whether or not it survives contact with the enemy, you're going to have to wait until the next episode to find out. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching the Siege of Vraxx series. If you liked it, do consider spreading it around a bit, since YouTube is not overly fond of this sort of content, and it would help me out an absolute ton. Now then, until next time, have a good day.
And of course, it ends right there. Okay, so I said that because I've got some good news, but after some bad news about the Siege of Vraxx series. Okay, so anyone who knows my channel knows that I put my requests on a list. And each of these lists get numbers, and that's how you can associate and relate. When it was first requested, the Siege of Vraxx series as a series, I had written down all available videos, and then continued on with my list, taking in more requests. The problem with that is I did not know that it was an ongoing series. Yeah. So that means that this is reaction request video number 110. The next one will be 111. But you're not going to see another reaction from me on the Siege of Vraxx series until video A War of Angels as a reaction request 154. And again, I apologize for that. It's just I did not know that this was a continuating season or series. I didn't know that he'd be producing more and more of them. I didn't know when it'd end. As far as I know, it's still going. So I gotta keep adding them to the list, but don't worry, I will get to all of them in their due time. So that's the good news is I will be continuing reacting to the series. It's just gonna be down the road some. So Siege of Vraxx series is brought to us by Arch Warhammer. If you are not watching his stuff, I highly recommend it. It's quite good, and not all of it is Warhammer 40k series stuff either. There's other lore videos there. So in the description, I've put a link to help you find his channel if need be. Again, highly recommended. The requesters of this video, of this series of videos, Death Grips and CJ Falcon. So thank you for requesting that. So I guess it's time for my thoughts. What I learned in this, and it's getting so good. Now I'm gonna have to wait until request video 154 to continue it. Oi. But I'm sure there's plenty of good videos to come. What I've learned is the first line was forcing the Vraxx Spear back, and the Vraxx Spear was slowly giving them land as to not allow the Krieg army behind them, because that would be a bad thing. Eventually they just ended up deadlocked, at the second perimeter, and to get to that point, it had been 2 years, which was 1 year behind the schedule, and they spent another 5 years, get this, with no orders from outside leadership. Again, the Krieg boys were told, hold your positions, and they were left to handle things on their own. Which, I mean, they're not beyond handling things on their own, but 5 years of fighting followed, being left alone, and until it was discovered that the Alpha Legion, traitorous Astartes soldiers, had ended up on Varax and had joined sides with the Cardinal. So, when the help me signal was sent out, with like hardly any hope or expectation of it reaching anybody Astartes wise, the Dark Angels answered and sent half of their entire forces, 5 whole companies. And I'm excited about the Dark Angels because I've heard some things, but Varax is the first series where we're actually getting to see them. And of course, Astartes often do their own things. Apparently this group is just after their own interests, and will probably leave if they can ever get the Alpha Legion member that knows information that they want. But this is potentially good, even though they're going to do their own thing. They're going to shove the Krieg guys over. And, you know, it's still potentially a good thing, because at least it's a weapon pointed in the direction of the Krieg's enemies. So that's a good thing. There was a beautiful explanation of the basic plans of the Dark Angels, but their plans. Man, now I gotta wait till 154 because I was such a fool and didn't realize that it was a continuated series. But it will come. So there's my thoughts. But I do have some other good news. This is Request Reaction 110, which was the last video on my list video. So that means I'm going to, here soon, have another list video of, I think it's 19 videos, talking about 111 through 130. I'll put up a list so you can see what's coming next. And, yeah. Getting all pumped for all that's coming up. Plenty of art stuff for those of you that really like the art stuff. Yeah, and you'll see the list of this stuff. I'll put it up, and then you'll know what's coming. So that's about all I've got to say about that. So, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.